Okay, we're just going to have a look at how we sort of move from achieve to the merit and excellence, particularly in the conclusion, because we'll talk about the other elements, but since we're on conclusion and formal inference part of the assessment, this is going to be sort of really important to whether you're going to get past achieved or even get achieved at that point. So, um, first of all, in your conclusion, it has to have a brief summary of findings, and you have to answer your investigative question. So remember, your investigative question was, I wonder if there is a difference in the medians. And so you have to answer that question. And you also have to interpret your formal confidence interval. So was there a difference in the medians back in the population between the two groups? And also offer up an interpretation of your confidence interval. So here, where I've just highlighted, it says, based on this, I am 95% confident that back in the population, the median amount of coffee consumed by university students is between 93 and 238 units more than the median coffee consumed by young professionals. So that's your interpretation. That must be in your internal, and it must be it must be in probably your conclusion, right? You need to make sure that you've included your interpretation of the confidence interval, what those numbers actually mean. Okay, that's the first part. Then you have to go into answering your question, right? And coming up with a conclusion based on that. So you don't really need to use the numbers now because you've done that in the interpretation. So since both values are positive in the confidence interval, I can be confident that back in the population, and you would probably name what that population is, there is a difference between the median amount of coffee consumed between university students and young professionals. So I'm answering my question here. What is the question? What is there a difference? I wonder if there's a difference. Well, I'm saying there is a difference, right? There is a difference. And you have to have the population and the two groups mentioned in here. And then what is that difference? Well, and that the median amount of coffee consumed is greater for university students than the young professionals, because I already interpreted that up here. And I said that already. So it's just another way of making that statement. So what have I done? At achieved level, I must interpret the confidence interval with the numbers, and then I must answer my question. Yes, there is a difference, and this is it. This is what the difference is. That's achieved, right? So that's more or less what you must include for achieved. Now, to move forward to merit, we need to add a bit of stuff to this, right? We need to maybe, we need to talk about why we use median instead of mean, because those are both legitimate averages. Well, we use basically median, and we don't really talk about this because you don't get a choice. You have to use median. But you need to sort of insert a little bit about why we use median. Well, we use median as an average because mean can be affected by unusual values, outliers. And if you've got outliers or anything unusual in your data, they're going to skew your mean. So we use median for that reason. Just a little sentence. You need to link it to your hypothesis. So what was my hypothesis? Along with my question, I would have said, I predict that this is what I'm going to find, or research suggests that this is what's true, or the notion out there in the public is that they believe this, and I want to check if this is true, and so I make a prediction. Now, so then you make a sentence. This confirms whatever I find. This confirms or go against my prediction, and that male Kiwis would be larger than female Kiwis. And then you might talk about what the research suggests and why this might be the case. Why are females bigger than males? What is the biological reason genetically for that, and so on. Findings clearly communicated and linked to the population and to context. So the bigger group of Kiwis, we had different species. Would we want to look at those individual species to make this a better report? Because maybe there is a size issue around the different species or varieties of Kiwis. Who might it be important to? Who would this data be useful to? Biologists and people keeping count of Kiwis and blah, blah, blah. Figure out how healthy the population is if your females are not as big as your males. Is a sample representative? So this is the one we're going to talk a little bit about here, because to get to excellence, you must do this, right? So this is sort of where you get your E out of for the conclusion. Is the sample representative? Large enough? Are there any biases or non-sampling error? So let's talk about non-sampling error. Now, we actually did some work on non-sampling error in our time series. In the conclusion, it must discuss if the sample is representative of the population or not. If not, why not? So we basically assume that the sample is representative, but then we might have some concerns. Um, the sample is not going to be represented, first of all, if it's not a random sample. So that's the biggie. If it's not random, you can throw the whole thing out. It can't be representative of the population. But probably it's going to be random. Now, other things, if the sampling process is such that a specific group is excluded or underrepresented in the sample, right? So you've done a sample, but you sampled, all the people in a girls' school, and you're going to make some sort of inference to the population of year 11s. Well, if you do it from a girls' school, you've excluded boys. So that's a problem, and that creates bias, right? The sampling process allows individuals to select themselves. So you've got this self-selection. So people with self-selection tend to have very strong views about things that may not be a balanced point of view, and you may create bias. Bias will occur if people refuse to answer and have different views of the survey issues. So if they don't answer at all, that's a problem. Low response rate. If people can't be asked during your survey, now I'm not going to do it. Those people that do reply probably have a very strong opinion about what they're replying to. And so again, you're building in bias if you've got a low response rate. So these things can happen, and hopefully you might get some information about what's happening, and you can make some decisions about whether you're happy with that, and how this could affect or bias the results that you get. So I've just used this example out of Walker. It's about 62 hockey players were wearing tracking devices for their weekend game. The date was Saturday, May 15th, so they did this on one day. The distance they ran in kilometers during the game was recorded. At the end of the game, the data was collated, and the hockey players' positions were noted. So we've got a size of 62 hockey players it becomes our sample for basically, I guess, the population would be hockey players in New Zealand. Well, we've got some issues with this. So for the very first thing, my issue is a size of 62 is not big enough. That's a very small sample to make any kind of conclusion about. So I'm not happy with the size of this. Remember, size is important because the bigger your sample is, the less variability you have between your samples. So you get a much more accurate representation of what's going on. If your sample is very small, this leads to a large amount of variability in your sampling parameters, and it's going to probably be a lot less likely to be accurate snapshot of what's going on in the population. So that's my first concern. The other thing is that my other concern is that this was only conducted on one day. So on one day, there might have been a number of key people missing from this group, and people were left out. So that can create bias. And then there is no information about gender, age, level of competition. Therefore, it's hard to know who this data and findings can be applied to. Like if you're talking about national level competitions, or are you talking about club competitions, or are you talking about, year fives, 5-year-olds competition? Like there's no information. So I don't know how I'm going to be able to apply this information to a population unless I know kind of what this data, where it came from, and who was involved in it, is it representative of the population? Is it adults? Is it representative of the adult population? So we have some issues. And so this is what you need to talk about. You don't do a lot. You notice that this is sufficient. You need to talk about 1 or 2 sampling errors and sort of how they might impact the application of this data and the findings to the population and so on. But you don't need to go into huge depth. You don't have time. It's a poster. It is not a dissertation. And that's pretty much it.